These are the terrifying true stories of those who encountered the wild inhabitants of the hills.
I was helping my cousin fix a broken fence on the edge of town when I first noticed it. The shape in the shadows behind the old barn. It was late afternoon, and the sun had already dipped low behind the ridges, leaving the woods heavy with shadows that seemed to press close. At first, I thought it was just some stray dog or maybe a raccoon, but the way it moved didn't fit anything I'd ever seen. It crouched low, almost melting into the darkness, and it didn't skitter or shuffle like an animal. It paused, then shifted with deliberate, careful steps, watching us with eyes that felt almost too intelligent to be natural. I froze for a second, trying to tell myself I was imagining it, but the shape stayed there, crouched and alert, like it was measuring us, waiting. My cousin, oblivious to my hesitation, kept hammering at the fence, muttering about loose boards. I tried to call him back, but the words caught in my throat. The thing in the shadows didn't make a sound, yet somehow it was speaking to me with its presence alone. As we edged closer to the barn, trying to finish before dusk, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of dry leaves set my nerves on fire. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a stray dog, but the way those eyes held me in place, unblinking and calculating, left no room for comfort. I remember my heart pounding in my chest when my cousin finally dared to call out, asking if there was something behind the barn. The response wasn't what either of us expected. The figure, if it could even be called that, vanished. 1 second it was crouched there, the next it had slipped into the trees like it had never been there at all. Only broken brush and the faint metallic scent remained, clinging to the air like rusted blood. That night, I tried to shake it off, but sleep wouldn't come. From my room in the old farmhouse nearby, I kept hearing faint scratching at the windows, soft enough to be mistaken for the wind at first. Then came the whispers. Low, almost human, like someone standing just out of sight, murmuring my name. I told myself it was the wind again, or maybe I was imagining it, but every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. I couldn't get the barn, the eyes, or that deliberate crouch out of my mind. Morning brought a cold clarity. I went back to the barn, hoping to dismiss it all as nerves or shadows, but the footprints told a different story. They weren't mine. They weren't my cousin's. They were small, irregular, and seemed to have a strange human-like balance, almost like someone moving on all fours but upright enough to leave distinct impressions in the mud. I followed them for a few yards into the tree line, but they vanished, swallowed up by the undergrowth and shadow. I realized then that whatever had been behind the barn had been closer than I wanted to admit, and it was still around. Over the next few days, the area around the barn felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, almost stagnant, and I noticed that my dog, usually fearless, refused to go near the fence without shaking and growling at nothing. My cousin laughed it off, but I could see he was uneasy too, though he wouldn't say it aloud. At night, I kept waking to sounds of movement outside my window. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, but nothing ever fully revealed itself. The whispers continued too, always faint, always at the edge of hearing, like a voice that might vanish if I leaned too close. It wasn't just fear, it was that quiet knowledge that someone, or something, was learning the patterns of our lives, waiting for mistakes, waiting for doors left open or lights left out. One evening, I stayed late near the barn to check the fence alone. The sun had gone down, and the only light came from my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. I heard a faint shuffle behind me and spun around, but nothing was there. Then came the eyes, glinting in the distance, reflecting my light for just a heartbeat. They weren't moving the way an animal's would. They were steady, intelligent, measuring. I felt a cold wash of terror as I realized I wasn't dealing with a stray animal, or even a person in the woods. This was something that belonged to these shadows, had grown in these trees, and it was patient. Too patient. I left the barn and the fence half-fixed, heart racing, the whispers following me all the way to the house. That night, sleep came only in broken fits, haunted by glimpses of movement out the corner of my eye and that metallic tang in the air, lingering in the nostrils like a warning. I began to notice subtle signs, something moving in the yard, rustling that didn't match the wind, and an uncanny sense of being observed even when I was alone in the house. Every night, the scratching at the window grew a little louder, the whispers a little clearer, always at the edge of recognition, always just out of reach. Weeks later, when my cousin and I went back to finish the fence, the barn seemed quieter, but heavier. The footprints had multiplied, crisscrossing the yard, leading into the woods and back again. We didn't talk about what we saw. We didn't need to. The feeling in the air said enough. We weren't alone, and we never had been. Whatever it was, it had made that corner of the property its own. And I knew, deep down, it hadn't stopped watching. Even now, years later, I still get a shiver when I drive past the barn. Sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I see those eyes, crouched low in the shadows, following me, waiting for the next time I think I'm alone. I moved into the small rental house on Pine Street in the older part of town, thinking it would be a quiet change from my cramped apartment downtown. The house had sat empty for years, its paint peeling and shutters hanging unevenly, and the neighbors were eager to warn me about it, but I waved it off as small-town superstition. They whispered about the family that had lived there long ago, a reclusive bunch that disappeared without explanation, leaving the house to rot. At first, nothing happened. The air was heavy with dust, and the floors creaked under my steps, but it was the normal kind of old house noise, or so I thought. The first night, I woke to the softest of sounds, almost like a sigh, coming from the living room. I froze under the covers, telling myself it was the wind moving through the broken shutters. But then I heard it again, a low whisper calling my name, just loud enough for me to be sure someone, or something, was speaking to me. My pulse hammered in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the living room. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that floated like ghosts, but no one was there. The front door was locked tight, the windows shut, yet the whispers persisted, curling around my ears, almost teasing me. Over the next few days, the unease grew. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes, a shadow flitting across the hallway, a figure just outside the window that vanished the moment I looked directly. I tried to rationalize it, blaming my nerves or the overgrown trees pressing against the house, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I began to notice strange marks on the walls, faint handprints smeared in dust, some high enough I knew no adult could have made them without climbing. I didn't see the marks appear, but every morning they were more distinct, more purposeful. One evening, I heard the footsteps on the stairs above me. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. I lived alone, and I hadn't brought anyone in. My breath caught as I pressed my back against the wall, listening to each creak, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel presence, movement, and intelligence. Something, or someone, was inside the house, watching, learning my habits, waiting for me to drop my guard. I started leaving lights on and doors locked, but the sense of eyes on me didn't fade. Sleep became impossible. I'd wake at odd hours, drenched in sweat, hearing whispers that weren't quite words but carried meaning, as if a mind just beyond comprehension was studying mine. The air in the house grew heavier, the shadows thicker, as if the walls themselves had become alive. I began avoiding certain rooms, feeling a suffocating dread whenever I neared the kitchen or the hall closet. The house seemed to breathe around me, quiet but aware, patient and unyielding. By the end of the second week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, as rain pounded the roof and lightning flickered across the yard, I saw a figure at the edge of the yard, standing just past the dim glow of the porch light. Motionless, watching. My heart froze. I opened the door and called out, but the figure didn't move, didn't respond. When I stepped closer, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but that lingering sense of being studied. I realized then that whatever haunted this house wasn't trying to scare me. It was waiting, observing, patient, understanding. I moved out shortly after, unable to endure the weight of it any longer. But even now, when I drive past that corner of Pine Street, I feel the same tension pressing down, a memory of eyes watching from the windows, waiting for the next tenant to underestimate the quiet intelligence of the house. I still wonder what that family left behind, and if whatever lingered there had been there long before them, and will remain long after. The whispers, the footsteps, the shadows, they're all still there, hidden, waiting, and I know that anyone who steps inside that hushed house will feel it too. I had been hiking through the hollow behind the creek for years, always looking for a quiet spot away from the small town, where the woods pressed close and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the creek bubbling over the stones. That afternoon, I thought I'd found a shortcut home, a narrow path winding between the old oaks and rhododendrons. At first, it felt familiar, comforting even, the kind of place where I could breathe and leave the town's noise behind. But the deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birds stopped singing, the breeze faded, and even the creek seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it. Soft voices, low and murmuring, carried on the wind in a way that didn't make sense. They weren't loud enough to be human conversation, but they weren't random either. They spoke in fragments, syllables that almost formed words, like a warning I couldn't understand. My first thought was children playing, maybe lost campers, but the tone was wrong, deliberate, sharp, and full of something I couldn't name. I froze, straining to listen, but the voices seemed to shift and move with me, never in one place for long, almost as if they were following me. I tried to retrace my steps, to leave the hollow the way I had come, but the trail twisted in ways I didn't recognize. Roots and rocks seemed to shift underfoot, and the familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by a labyrinth of gnarled trees and heavy underbrush. Shadows moved just at the edge of my vision, something small and fast, darting between trunks, never fully revealed. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of shapes that crouched low, watching, or of eyes glinting faintly in the dimming light. I told myself it was imagination, that I had wandered too far and fatigue was catching up, but my gut told me otherwise. The voices grew more distinct as night fell. Whispers came from every direction, weaving together in a pattern I couldn't make sense of. I could feel the hollow around me pressing closer, closing me in. I tried calling out, my voice cracking in the cold, damp air, but it only made the whispers louder, sharper, almost as if I had drawn attention to myself. The hairs on my neck stood on end when I realized I wasn't alone. Something was moving, stalking me between the trees, unseen but deliberate. The faintest snaps of twigs echoed unnaturally, never close enough to locate, yet never far. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time became meaningless in that hollow. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't stop moving. Every path I tried led me deeper, further from the world I knew. And always the whispers, always the shadows just out of reach, watching, waiting, learning the rhythm of my fear. At one point, I stumbled into a small clearing and thought I saw them. Figures crouched low to the ground, their movements too deliberate to be animals, too quick to be human. They melted into the trees before I could focus, leaving only the echo of the whispers hanging in the night air. When I finally broke through the thick forest, emerging onto the road that led back to town, it felt almost dreamlike. The town seemed distant, unreal, and the ordinary lights of street lamps and passing cars made me feel dizzy with relief. But even then, I could still hear the faintest echoes of those murmuring voices, a memory that clung to my mind like a stain. I never returned to that hollow, and I warn anyone who does to beware of shortcuts. Beware of quiet places where the wind dies and the forest seems to lean closer. The hollow is patient. It waits for the lost and the careless, learning them, marking them. And sometimes, when the night is still and the wind carries the wrong kind of sound, I swear I can still hear the whispers, telling me I was never really alone. I used to fish near the creek every morning, long before the town woke up, enjoying the quiet and the slow rhythm of the water over the stones. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself and feel the world shrink down to nothing but the trees, the water, and the soft slap of your boots in the mud. That morning, the mist hung low over the creek, curling around the tree trunks like smoke, and I noticed a man standing in the water about 50 feet downstream. At first, I thought he was another fisherman, maybe someone new in town, but something about him made my stomach twist. He wasn't moving, not really. Just standing there, stiff, watching me. I waved, hoping to get a response, but he didn't move a muscle. His eyes were fixed on me, and there was something deliberate in the way he held himself, a patience that didn't belong to a casual fisherman. I shrugged it off, telling myself he was probably just early for a morning cast and didn't want to be bothered. But the next morning, he was back, standing in almost the same spot, and the day after that too. Always motionless, always watching. I started noticing subtle things, small movements in the brush, twigs snapping just beyond reach, and the odd feeling that he was somehow everywhere at once, appearing downstream, then upstream, then closer to the bank as I tried to fish. One evening, I decided to confront him. I called out, but the words caught in my throat when I saw how still he remained. Then, just as I stepped closer, he moved. Not like a normal person would move, but fluid, careful, as if calculating every motion. I froze, and he disappeared into the trees without a sound, leaving nothing but the faintest trail of crushed leaves and the lingering coppery smell of mud and something else, something metallic I couldn't place. That night, I slept fitfully, haunted by every small sound outside my cabin. Branches scratching against the siding, the distant rush of water, and the odd creak of the floorboards upstairs that I'd never noticed before. I started finding signs near the creek, crude shelters hidden in the undergrowth, remnants of food, clothing, and footprints that weren't mine. It became clear to me that he had been there for a long time, following, observing, learning my routines. The thought chilled me more than any storm or cold night ever had. After weeks of this, I stopped going to the creek. I told myself it was safer to let him have the place than risk running into him in the woods. But I knew better. Whatever he wasn't human in the way we are, not really. He belonged to the creek and the trees, patient and silent, waiting for the right moment to step back into my world. Even now, years later, I drive past that stretch of water and I feel it, the awareness that someone is watching, that those eyes are still there, tracking the people who think the woods are theirs. And I know, without a doubt, that if I ever return, he will be there too, crouched just beyond the mist, waiting. I took shelter in that abandoned farmhouse during a winter storm because I didn't have a choice. The roads were icing over faster than my old truck could handle, and the wind was howling hard enough to shake the trees sideways. I'd been hunting out near the ridge and misjudged the weather, so when I spotted the crooked outline of that house through the white blur of snowfall, I saw it more as salvation than danger. Looking back now, I should have stayed in the truck. I should have taken my chances on the road. Anything would have been better than stepping inside that place and learning what lived above me. The house felt wrong the moment I walked in. Old wood always settles, but this wasn't the creak of age. It was the faint impression that something had just moved, just stepped out of sight. I brushed off the snow and closed the door against the storm, trying to convince myself the strange heaviness in the air was just the cold. The living room was dim, lit only by my flashlight beam and the gray light leaking in through cracked boards. Dust coated everything. The smell was stale but carried something else too, something faintly metallic like wet iron. I ignored it, telling myself it was just rust. I set my pack down near the wall and started a small fire in the ancient stone fireplace, more for comfort than warmth. The storm rattled the windows, and snow slammed against the roof hard enough to echo. That's when I heard it, scratching, faint but steady, coming from the attic above me. I froze, listening. It wasn't mice. I'd lived in the mountains my whole life. I knew the sound of vermin. This had weight behind it. Slow, uneven drags, followed by soft taps, like fingertips brushing the floorboards. I told myself the wind was tricking my ears, so I stoked the fire higher and unpacked my blanket, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. But the scratching didn't stop. Every few minutes it would return. Sometimes directly above me, sometimes near the far end of the attic, pacing, shifting, like whatever was up there couldn't decide where to settle. An hour passed before curiosity and fear finally overpowered reason. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the narrow staircase leading up. The steps groaned under my weight, the air growing colder the higher I climbed. Halfway up, the scratching stopped. Dead silence settled over the house. My breath fogged in the beam of my light as I reached the attic door. It hung slightly open, just wide enough for darkness to spill through. I nudged the door with my boot, and it creaked open. I swept the flashlight across the space, dust swirling like disturbed snowflakes. At first, I saw nothing, just old trunks, broken furniture, and a collapsed section of roof where moonlight filtered in. Then, in the far corner just beyond the reach of the light, something shifted. A figure, small, pale, curled low to the ground like a child hiding. My heart slammed against my ribs. I raised the light again, trying to steady my hand. For a second, nothing happened. Then 2 eyes opened, reflecting the beam with a haunted, glinting stare that wasn't human, or at least, not fully human. The creature, or whatever it was, darted away, faster than anything that size should move. The flashlight caught only a blur of limbs as it vanished into a gap in the far wall. Panic rooted me in place. I backed down the stairs without turning my back on that gap, every step trembling under me. Back in the living room, I locked the attic door, though I knew it wouldn't matter if that thing wanted to come down. The storm outside howled louder, drowning the sounds from above, at least for a while. But even the wind couldn't hide everything. Around midnight, I heard it moving again. It scraped along the beams, directly above where I sat by the dimming fire. Sometimes it sounded like it was crawling on its belly, dragging itself across the floorboards. Other times, like it was climbing. Fingers hooking into wood, shifting weight with slow, deliberate strength. Then came the whispering breaths. Soft, shallow, almost curious. Like it was studying me through the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I sat upright until the fire died and the shadows thickened, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. At some point I must have drifted because the next thing I knew, the scratching was coming from the wall behind me. Slow, rhythmic, closer than before. I held my breath listening. The creature traced along the inside of the wall, following the studs and beams, its movements purposeful, knowing exactly where the hollows were, where it could get closest. A soft thud landed directly behind my head. I shot up, nearly tripping over my pack. The wall bulged slightly, like something pressed against it from inside. Then came a low exhale, warm enough to fog the thin paint. It stayed there for a moment, breathing, as if smelling me through the wall. Then it moved again, scuttling upward, returning to the attic. That was my breaking point. As soon as daylight seeped through the snow-covered windows, I grabbed my gear, stomped out the dying embers of the fire, and opened the door. The storm had calmed, leaving the world eerily quiet, muffled under a thick blanket of white. I didn't dare look back as I trudged through the snow to my truck. The ignition fought me, coughing before catching, and I peeled away from that house without a second glance. For years, I avoided that part of the ridge. I told myself the creature must have been some feral kid, some poor soul hiding in the walls. But deep down, I knew better. Something had lived there long before I arrived, and long before the family who abandoned the place. Something that moved with purpose, watched with unsettling intelligence, and waited for storms to cover its sounds. Months later, when spring thawed the first snows, I drove past that road again. Just a quick glance. The house stood crooked and broken, shadows gathering around the windows like bruises. And in the highest one, the attic window, I saw them again. Those same reflective eyes, unblinking, patient, watching me drive past as if it remembered me. Maybe it did. I don't go near the ridge anymore. And on cold winter nights, when storms roll across the mountains and wind beats on the glass, I sometimes hear faint scratching along my siding. Slow, testing, patient, almost like something found me again.